I'm Rose Langford, 32, and I helped turn my father's modest logistics firm into a growing regional operation. For years, I supported his oldest friend and competitor, stepping in to handle clients, clean up shipments, and keep things running when no one else would. But when he shut me down in front of a national client and told me I was too young to understand business, I made a decision that changed everything. Have you ever poured your time, energy, and loyalty into someone, only to be dismissed like you never mattered? If you have, I'd like to hear your story in the comments because you're definitely not alone. Before I get into the details, drop where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to take your power back after being underestimated or betrayed, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about holding your ground and building something better. Because what happened next caught even him by surprise. My dad started Langford Logistics in our garage when I was 6. Back then, it was just 2 folding tables, a landline, and a whiteboard with permanent marker stains. He handled freight coordination by day, invoicing at night, and I'd fall asleep on the couch listening to him go back and forth with warehouse reps. By the time I was in high school, I could quote shipping rates by zone and had memorized every carrier's surcharge schedule. He never pushed me into the business, but he didn't have to. I saw what he built, and I wanted to be a part of it. College wasn't a question. It was Wharton or nothing. He'd grown the company enough by then to send me without loans. I spent 4 years studying supply chain systems while checking routing issues from my dorm between classes. By junior year, I was consulting for his mid-size accounts in the Midwest. After graduation, I stepped into the business full-time, handling most of the client strategy and vendor negotiation. My dad focused on operations, which he still preferred. It worked. What didn't always work was our relationship with Ron Langston. Ron ran Langston Freight Services, a much larger company in the same sector. He and my dad had known each other for over 2 decades, started out as friendly competitors, and over time, Ron positioned himself as a sort of senior advisor to my dad. I never quite bought the mentor act. He'd take credit for giving us overflow work, but most of it was headache clients or urgent last-mile shipments his teams couldn't handle. We'd pull strings, fix the issues, get no thanks, and somehow Ron always made it sound like he'd thrown us a bone. Still, my dad stayed loyal. He called Ron a survivor, someone who had weathered 3 recessions and a pandemic. I saw someone who outsourced his problems and didn't blink when others took the fall. But I kept my mouth shut. My dad believed in relationships, even if they were lopsided. And, to be fair, Ron had pulled through for us once. During a cash crunch in 2018, he helped float a fuel invoice that saved our payroll that month. My dad never forgot that. Neither did I. But that was the exception, not the rule. Ron was sharp in public, polished, well-spoken, always on. But behind closed doors, he was more self-serving than strategic. He liked to act like he was grooming the next generation, but never gave real access. I watched him do it with his own employees, too. He had a revolving door of junior VPs and regional leads, none of whom stayed more than 2 years. The only constant was Ron, front and center, taking credit. I remember the first time I pitched a new routing model to one of his teams. I was 25, maybe a year into working full-time. We'd found a way to cut 2 days off one of his regional distribution loops, saving about 0 a quarter. I walked him through the logic, gave him the data, showed him the test results. He nodded, barely said anything, then ended the meeting early. A week later, I saw a press release on his website about Langston's new efficiency breakthrough. Same model, same numbers, no mention of us. I brought it up to my dad. He sighed, said, "Ron's always been like that. Take it as a compliment." So I did, but it stuck with me. Over the next few years, our involvement with Ron's company deepened. He used us to fill gaps during peak season, called when clients threatened to walk, and leaned on us for special project work. We never said no. We were good, fast, quiet, and we never missed deadlines. When my dad had his stroke, everything changed. It happened on a Sunday morning. I got the call just after 7 a.m. He was in stable condition, but would need long-term recovery. He wasn't going to be back at work anytime soon. For the first 2 weeks, I barely left the hospital. I checked emails at night, pushed project updates during visiting hours. Ron showed up on day 3 with flowers and a bottle of bourbon. Said all the right things, told me he'd be there for anything we needed. I thanked him. 3 days later, I found out he'd emailed 2 of our core clients directly, offering to temporarily absorb their logistics under his umbrella while we got things sorted. One of them agreed. I confronted him. He brushed it off, said it was just temporary. Just trying to help you out, Rose. That was his line. I let it go, mostly because I didn't have the energy to fight. My dad was in a hospital bed, unable to speak. I was managing 18 vendor contracts, 4 shipping lanes, and payroll without a CFO. Losing 1 or 2 clients felt manageable at the time. It was a mistake. That winter, Ron started introducing his son Alex as head of emerging accounts. Alex was 29, 2 years older than me, and had just finished an MBA somewhere expensive. Ron started bringing him to meetings I used to lead. During one joint strategy call, I showed up and found out Alex had already sent a revised version of my proposal to the client. I said nothing. Just adjusted, adapted, moved on. My dad came back to the office in a wheelchair 6 months after the stroke. He only stayed an hour, but it meant everything. I gave him the update he asked for. Revenue, losses, which clients had stayed. I told him Ron had been helping. He just looked at me. "Watch him," he said. Then he went quiet. From that point on, I started tracking more than invoices. I pulled balance sheets, looked into vendor behavior, noted which of Ron's assets had recently changed hands. There was something off. I couldn't explain it fully at the time. Just a sense. But I started digging anyway. We kept doing work for Ron through the spring. One day, it was backfill on a regional route. The next, a customs clearance issue he wanted fixed discreetly. He paid late, always had an excuse. I absorbed it. Because that's what we did. We fixed other people's problems. We made things work. And people like Ron smiled, shook hands, and called it mentorship. But I wasn't playing that role anymore. I was watching, learning, and waiting. For now, I stayed in the background. But I didn't plan to stay there for long. The first time I heard that Ron had signed a long-term deal with one of our legacy clients, I thought it had to be a mistake. It was a Tier 1 account, a regional medical supply company we'd handled for 6 years. We knew their quarterly flow inside and out. I'd personally managed 3 back-to-back contract renegotiations, including the pandemic-era price freeze that saved them from switching providers. We were up for renewal that spring. Everything looked clean until I noticed their monthly order volume had dropped without warning. I called our contact there. She sounded hesitant, said Ron had reached out and made a really compelling case. When I pressed, she admitted the new agreement was already signed. 2-year deal. Exclusive. His team would handle everything. When I asked Ron about it, he waved it off. "You've got enough on your plate," he said. "Figured I'd take something off your shoulders." I didn't say anything, just looked at him. He poured himself a cup of coffee like it was nothing. "It's temporary," he added. "Like that would make it better. Once your dad's back on his feet, we'll rebalance everything." We both knew my dad wasn't coming back in that way. He had good days, and days where he couldn't find words for basic questions. But Ron never acknowledged that reality. It was always temporary, always helpful, always on his terms. By the end of that quarter, 3 of our top 5 clients had migrated to Ron's firm, all under the pretense of helping us stay afloat. 2 of them had overlapping service lines with his newer distribution centers, which we hadn't been told about. One had even been routed through our own lease drivers for the first few weeks. He hadn't even bothered to reroute properly, just layered over our ops team with his own name on the invoice. That was when I realized he wasn't helping, he was replacing. Meanwhile, Alex kept showing up. He was at Ron's side in every meeting now, especially when there were clients present. Always dressed like he was pitching a VC firm. Designer jacket, no tie, subtle watch. Ron introduced him the same way every time. My son, Alex. He's bringing fresh perspective to the company. At first, I tried to stay neutral. Maybe he was just being groomed. Maybe Ron was trying to build his succession plan, and I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that theory fell apart quickly. One of our shared clients had a quarterly performance review, and I was the one scheduled to present. I'd built the dashboard, prepped the ops reports, and confirmed the agenda. 15 minutes before the call, I was looped into a revised invite, now labeled Langston Client Strategy Meeting. Alex was hosting. I sat there watching him present my data, my slides, with my name scrubbed off the version. He got a few things wrong. No one corrected him. When I asked Ron about it later, he smiled. Just giving the kids some practice. He called Alex the future. He called me kid, too, but not in a warm way. It was always laced with condescension, like he was letting me stay in the room out of politeness. Over time, the language shifted. Ron stopped asking for help. He started issuing updates. We've taken over the northern corridor. We've moved the medical accounts to our Richmond hub. We're handling fulfillment directly going forward. There was no discussion. No review. He just expected me to nod and keep supporting the scraps we still had. The worst part wasn't even the disrespect. It was how calculated it all was. Ron never told me outright that I was being phased out. He didn't have to. He let the empty schedule speak for itself. Meetings I used to lead were reassigned. Clients I had direct lines to were rerouted through his admin team. Our role shrank each month, and every time I tried to recalibrate, he moved the target. I tried talking to my dad about it. He listened, asked a few quiet questions, then sat back and closed his eyes. He didn't say it directly, but I could feel it, regret. Not just over what Ron was doing, but over what he'd allowed for so long. There's a specific silence that comes when someone realizes they've trusted the wrong person. That silence sat with me for days. Around that time, Ron started making little digs in front of others. He'd interrupt me mid-sentence on calls, tell clients I was still learning. Once, after I presented a new cost-saving model, he leaned back and said, "That's cute. We ran those numbers 5 years ago." Then he laughed, like we were just exchanging banter. No one else laughed. The message was clear. I wasn't his equal. I wasn't even on the same ladder. In his mind, I was the assistant who'd outstayed her welcome. I started noticing how deferential people became around him. Vendors who used to deal with me directly now CC'd Alex. Carriers started switching their billing references to his new client codes. It was like the logistics world had quietly been informed that Langston Freight was absorbing Langford Logistics. No announcement, no acquisition, just a quiet, systematic erasure. I didn't push back publicly. There was nothing to gain from it. Ron wasn't going to give me anything by confrontation. That wasn't how he operated. He moved slowly, with plausible deniability. By the time you noticed the shift, it was already over. But I wasn't naive. I started documenting everything. Every rerouted invoice, every unauthorized contract switch, every internal memo I wasn't copied on but found later. I compiled a full financial trail, not just ours, but his too. His expansion wasn't organic. He'd taken out at least 3 major credit lines in the last 18 months. And with every new distribution center, his operational overhead climbed. He looked strong from the outside, but his books told a different story. There was one night in particular I remember. I'd been reviewing shipping manifests from one of the clients Ron had poached. A logistics coordinator I knew well had forwarded them to me, thinking I was still managing the route. They were riddled with delays. 4 shipments late, 2 rerouted incorrectly, 1 had expired stock. I didn't say anything, just filed the documents away. At the same time, my own team, the 6 people Ron had mostly forgotten I still employed, were running flawlessly. Our smaller pool of clients had 100% on-time delivery. Zero returns. Happy reviews. But we were invisible now. That's when it hit me. He wasn't just underestimating me. He was blind to me entirely. And I realized there's power in being underestimated. If someone's convinced you're not a threat, they won't guard their weaknesses. They'll brag. They'll overspend. They'll stop preparing. Ron was preparing for his legacy, but he'd already handed me the playbook. I didn't need to confront him. I just needed to wait and plan. It was a Thursday morning in mid-April, and we were pitching to a national retail chain with over 400 stores. They were consolidating their distribution partners, and we'd been shortlisted after months of quiet prep. The opportunity was massive, not just for the revenue, but for the footprint. If we landed the contract, it would shift the weight of the entire region. I'd been working on the proposal since January. 60 pages. Route optimization by region, detailed cost per mile breakdowns, a scalable solution for seasonal spikes, and a phased transition plan that would move their full inventory within 90 days. The meeting was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. sharp. It was held at the client's corporate office, big glass atrium, long walnut table, 5 execs on their side, just 2 from ours. I showed up early. Ron and Alex arrived 6 minutes late, joking with each other as they walked in. Ron gave me a nod, barely made eye contact, and took the head of the table. I set up the deck, pulled the packet copies from my bag, and went through my intro with the clients, while Ron scrolled through his phone. We started strong. The execs responded well to the regional breakdown. They asked sharp questions. I answered clearly. We got into the cost analysis, and I was mid-sentence explaining the adjustment levers for fuel volatility when Ron raised a hand slightly and said, "Let me stop you there." I paused. He turned to the clients. "I want to give you the high-level version," he said. "She's still learning the ropes, but I think what Rose is trying to say is..." Then he started talking. Fast, confident, with that salesman rhythm he always used when he was covering for not knowing the details. He didn't look at the deck, didn't reference the plan, just rattled off buzzwords and margin promises that weren't even in our offer. One of the clients asked about the staggered integration timeline. Ron dodged the question. Another asked about warehouse redundancy. He said, "We've got it covered," and moved on. Alex chimed in once, talking about centralized efficiency and next-gen optimization. They'd both skimmed the packet, but they hadn't read it, and it showed. I sat there, silent, staring at the deck I'd built. Slide after slide went unmentioned. I watched the executive team slowly pull back. Not obviously, but you could feel it in the shift of their posture. One of them stopped taking notes. Another closed the packet early. The room cooled. Afterward, in the hallway, I waited until the clients left before I said anything. Ron was still smiling, like we'd just closed the deal. I didn't yell, just asked, "Why did you cut me off?" He shrugged. It was getting too technical. That's what they asked for. They wanted leadership, not logistics. Then he turned to walk away, stopped, and looked back. "You're too young to understand business," he said. "This is the big leagues now." Then he left. Alex stayed behind for a second, but didn't say anything. Just gave me this awkward half nod and followed his father out. I didn't move, not for a long time. The hallway emptied out, office doors shut, lights dimmed. I finally walked out to the parking lot, sat in my car, and didn't start it. Just stared at the steering wheel, hands still resting in my lap. I wasn't angry, not in that moment. I was still. It wasn't the first time Ron had undermined me. It wasn't the worst thing he'd done. But it was the first time he'd said it out loud. That I didn't belong. That I wasn't enough. I stayed there for 40 minutes. Not crying, not venting, just deciding. I drove straight to the office, pulled the backup packet copies from our shared system and stored them in a private folder. Removed access. Then I logged into our research database and spent the next 4 hours pulling financial data on Langston Freight. I wasn't going to complain. I wasn't going to try to win his respect back. That was never the point. What mattered now was clarity and leverage. The meeting had been a test, not for the client, but for me. Ron had made it clear that in his world, I'd hit my ceiling. He saw me as a tool, useful when needed, sidelined when not. I had one card left in his game, and he'd already played it. There was no partnership, no mentorship, no trust. I drove home late that night, past dark, and sat on the back steps of my apartment. The deck was still in my bag. I didn't even take it out. That moment in the hallway, the smirk, the shrug, the line, stayed with me, not because it hurt, but because it clarified everything. He didn't see me as a threat. He didn't even see me as a variable. Just a placeholder. One he thought would eventually move out of the way. I didn't sleep much that night, but by morning, I had a list. Not of what I'd lost, but of everything he'd overlooked. Every blind spot, every dependency, every debt. And I knew exactly where to start. That weekend, I drove to my parents' house. My mom answered the door, hugged me too long, then handed me a cup of coffee before I even said hello. She didn't ask questions. Just walked me to the back room where my dad sat near the window, reading with a blanket on his legs. He looked better than I expected, thinner but alert. When he saw me, he put the book down and raised an eyebrow. I sat next to him and told him what had happened. The pitch meeting, the interruption, the line. He didn't react right away, just nodded slowly and looked out the window. Then he said, "He stole from us." Not angry, not even surprised, just stating a fact. I didn't answer. After a long pause, he added, "So take it back." That was it. No speech, no instructions, just that. Then he went quiet again. I left an hour later and drove straight to the office. I didn't bother turning on the lights. Just unlocked the door, opened my laptop, and pulled up everything we had on Ron's company. Invoices, payment history, shared clients, routing data, carrier partnerships. I started building a wall, column by column. He looked stable on the surface. Strong brand, loyal clients, regional reach. But if you trace the details, not the headlines, but the paperwork, a different picture emerged. His fleet was aging. That much I already knew. Most of the vehicles had passed 400, 0 miles. A third of them hadn't cleared inspection without advisories. His team patched and pushed. I'd heard the complaints from dispatch before. He was still carrying debt from the competitor buyout he made in late 2020. The one he'd announced like a triumph. It hadn't been a full purchase. He'd financed the deal through 2 short-term lenders and 1 mid-range holding group that specialized in distressed assets. I remembered the name. Back then, I didn't think much of it. But now, I looked them up. And they were selling off paper. He had one client responsible for nearly 50% of his active revenue, a national beverage distributor. If they pulled out, he'd be down to the bone. That client had strict performance clauses. I checked the public filings. They'd renewed with him in 2021, but the term ended this coming November. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. He was stretched. He had liabilities. And he was vulnerable. In very specific places. So I opened a new LLC. It wasn't under my name. Not directly. I used a quiet incorporation service and listed a former professor as the registered agent. The company had no website, no branding. Just a single mission. Acquire liens and assets tied to Langston Freight Holdings, wherever they appeared. I didn't do it loudly. I didn't post. I didn't tell friends. I didn't even mention it to the core staff I still employed. There was nothing to brag about. This wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. The first purchase came 2 weeks later. A small lien tied to a fleet maintenance contract, overdue by 120 days. I paid cash. They didn't ask questions. I moved it into a holding structure and kept going. The second was harder. A warehouse sublease in Indiana. The original owner wanted to renegotiate. Ron's team had fallen behind on utilities. I made an offer through the new LLC. took control with a simple assumption clause. No press release, no fanfare. Each move was small on its own, forgettable, but every asset came with documentation, signatures, terms, back-end data. And every time I acquired one, I saw a little more of his internal structure. It wasn't about ownership yet. It was about mapping, knowing where the weight sat, where the stress points were. Meanwhile, Ron kept operating like everything was fine, still held meetings, still took calls, still gave Alex credit for expanding their footprint. I didn't interfere, I didn't show my hand, but I paid attention. There was one night in particular. I was working late, going through vendor logs, when a junior rep from one of Ron's third-party carriers emailed me directly. She said she'd found an old version of a rate sheet we'd built years ago, back when we'd been handling Ron's overflow. She didn't realize she'd sent it. I thanked her and filed it away. It wasn't what she sent that mattered. It was what it confirmed. Ron had been using our models, the ones we'd built, stress-tested, refined, and marking them up under his own logo. He hadn't just replaced us, he'd replicated our systems and buried the source. That night, I logged into the LLC's back-end account and started preparing a more aggressive move. One of the holding groups was running an auction on a bundle of distressed commercial notes. 3 of them were tied to Langston-owned properties. I reviewed the terms, pre-qualified, and placed bids under a new entity that fed into the original LLC. By the end of the month, we controlled 3 liens, 2 leases, and 1 equipment financing note. Not enough to make a public move, but enough to get his attention if I wanted it. I didn't. Ron didn't know what was happening. He was still giving interviews to industry blogs, talking about the future of regional freight and mentoring the next generation. I didn't correct him. I just kept building. Once a week, I visited my dad. Sometimes we talked about the business. Sometimes we didn't. But he always asked one question before I left. "How's the list?" And I'd tell him, one item at a time. Nothing dramatic, just the facts. He never smiled. But once, after I mentioned the Indiana warehouse, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Good. That one mattered." By midsummer, I knew more about Ron's company than some of his own executives. I knew which vendors had stopped offering net terms. I knew which clients had flagged him for missed KPIs. I knew the fuel rates on his last contract were based on outdated benchmarks, and that he hadn't adjusted for the rising surcharge margin. He was slipping. Slowly, quietly, but the fall had already started. And I was the one holding the net. The first call came on a Monday afternoon. I was reviewing payment logs from a newly acquired lien on one of Ron's primary warehouse carriers when my phone lit up. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the area code. I let it ring twice before answering. "Rose," he said, drawing it out like we were old friends. "Been hearing your name come up in interesting places." I didn't respond. There was a pause, and then he tried again. "I assume you picked up that lien on the fleet maintenance note? Bold move." Still nothing from me. Finally, he added, "What are you doing, Rose? Trying to make a name for yourself?" I stayed quiet, long enough that he started to shift a little. I could hear it in his tone when he spoke again, less amused. "I mean, come on, this isn't how things are done." I thanked him for the call and hung up without another word. That was the first shift. The first time he realized I wasn't bluffing, not posturing, not playing his game. I wasn't here to send a message. I was here to take his company out from under him, piece by piece, and I wasn't going to give him the decency of a warning. 2 days later, one of our mutual contacts, an old vendor rep who owed Ron favors, called me directly. "Ron says you're making waves," he said carefully. "Wants to know if you're open to talking about a merger. Says maybe it's time to bring things full circle. Rebuild what your dad and he started." I told him I wasn't interested in being anyone's bridge to the past. Another week passed before Ron made his next move. He sent a proposal, formal, legal, drafted by counsel. It arrived in a neutral envelope to my office. addressed to my LLC by its corporate name. The letter was dense with vague optimism. A unique opportunity to realign values, leveraging shared history for mutual growth, and buried near the end, full merger contingent on management roles to be defined post-acquisition. I read it twice and flagged one sentence. We believe collaboration can restore trust and ensure legacy. Legacy. That was a word he kept using. Not revenue, not structure, not market share, just legacy. It told me everything I needed to know. He was worried about his name, his narrative, the story he'd built about being the survivor, the mentor, the man who made it through every economic crash. He could feel it slipping, and he thought I'd be sentimental enough to help him salvage it. I didn't reply. Instead, I contacted the holding group managing the lease on his Richmond facility. They were willing to offload it, not because it was distressed, but because they didn't want the risk of renewal. I submitted a bid through an affiliate and closed it within a week. We didn't evict, just let the renewal notice expire. It gave Ron 90 days to clear out. That's when things got louder. He started calling around. Vendors, former partners, even one of our clients. He said I was being reckless, that I didn't understand how these things worked, that I was burning bridges I didn't even build. A few people reached out to warn me, asked if I wanted to get ahead of it. I told them I wasn't making noise, just taking what was already vulnerable. By that point, his lenders were calling me directly, quietly, off the record. One of them had a bridge note from the competitor acquisition back in 2020. He hadn't met the revenue benchmarks. They were ready to sell. Another had a security interest in his vehicle management system, the core software that routed his freight operations. I didn't even know it had been collateralized. When I got the call, I asked for the terms. They emailed them within an hour. The software was under license through Q4. If the debt transferred, I could revoke usage at year-end. I bought the note that Friday. 2 weeks later, Ron emailed me directly. A full page, rambling, defensive, almost paternal in tone. He said we could still work something out. Said this was all a misunderstanding. Said he respected me. That he always had. I read it once and deleted it. Because here's the thing. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't trying to teach him a lesson or make a point. I didn't care if he ever understood what he'd done, or what it had cost. I wasn't in it for recognition, or closure. I was in it to win, quietly, legally, completely. By midsummer, I owned 6 of his outstanding notes. 3 properties were under leases I controlled. 2 vendors had signed direct contracts with my LLC to continue service, bypassing him entirely. His fuel rates went up. His driver turnover spiked. And he was 2 months behind on fleet maintenance for over a dozen vehicles. I knew, because I'd hired the firm that used to service them. Still, he kept trying to posture. He put out a press release in July about strategic restructuring, claimed they were realigning operations to focus on high-value markets. Internally, he cut routes, laid off staff, and froze hiring. But to the outside world, he kept smiling. Until his client list started shrinking. That beverage distributor, the one that made up nearly half his revenue, had noticed the missed delivery benchmarks. They opened a competitive bid process in early August. I didn't participate directly, but one of my partner companies did, and they used a fulfillment model I'd built back in March. I watched it unfold from a distance. He was still trying to play king, but the board was already cleared. I didn't make a scene, didn't call reporters, didn't celebrate. I just kept moving, steady, quiet. And I wasn't done. Not yet. It started small, like most things do. One vendor paused deliveries pending payment confirmation. Then, a third-party dispatch service cut night hours, citing logistics miscommunication. But I knew the signs. When a company misses 2 consecutive 15-day pay windows, it doesn't take long before the rest follow. By the end of September, I'd started getting questions from people Ron hadn't even mentioned in years. A former regional planner called to say her final paycheck had bounced. Another vendor, someone we both used for temperature-sensitive shipments, asked quietly if I was planning to pick up the route contracts he'd dropped. I said we'd consider it. I didn't say that I'd already started reconfiguring the entire service line with another team. Alex tried to step in. I expected that. Ron always talked about him like he was a prodigy. Said he'd be next in line once the business was in legacy mode. But Alex didn't understand freight. Not really. He understood spreadsheets and buzzwords, but not the nuance of seasonal surges, rerouting under stress, or what it meant when a regional fuel supplier stopped taking your calls. Within a month, the cracks weren't theoretical. They were public. Drivers were logging longer idle hours. Distribution centers in 2 states had scaling issues. One ran out of dock staff during a holiday cycle. Customers started complaining on procurement forums. Nothing viral, nothing catastrophic, just slow damage. Death by exposure. Meanwhile, I didn't say a word. I had no interest in broadcasting his collapse. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about precision. We were restructuring, quietly, methodically. I consolidated my holding companies under a new operational brand. Hired his former logistics lead, the one who'd left after a year of fighting with Alex over asset rotation and fleet scheduling. She came in with no conditions. Just asked for a clean budget and room to fix what she called the operational chaos I warned them about 2 years ago. She wasn't wrong. By then, I'd finalized contracts with 2 regional carriers Ron had burned years earlier. One of them still had the email Ron sent during the pandemic, telling them they were too small to matter. They never forgot that. When I offered to co-invest in routing tech upgrades, they signed without hesitation. The week after we launched our new operating system, Ron's name came up in an internal team call. One of our drivers said he'd run into an old contact who used to work for Langston. Said they were down to half their dispatch staff in the Northeast. No one had been formally let go. People just stopped showing up. I didn't respond, just took notes and moved the conversation along. The final call came on a Tuesday, mid-morning. I was between meetings when I saw the number, familiar area code, no contact name. The lender. They didn't waste time. We're exiting the commercial real estate note on Langston's main facility, the rep said. Are you still interested? I asked how quickly they needed to close. He said, by end of week. I wired the funds that day. No negotiation, no delay. The warehouse sat on a major logistics corridor, with multi-dock access and proximity to 2 rail lines. It was the backbone of Ron's operations. Every holiday surge ran through that building. And now, it belonged to me. The paperwork was ready by morning. We didn't force an eviction. We didn't even issue a press release. I gave them 45 days to vacate or renegotiate the lease under new terms. I already knew which they'd choose. Ron tried to call again, this time from his personal number. I didn't pick up. He left a voicemail. Said he hoped we could talk before lawyers got involved. Said he was open to restructuring. Said maybe we both got carried away. I deleted it. Not out of spite, just disinterest. I'd stopped playing his game months ago. This wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. I was rebuilding a business from its foundations, and he had built his on borrowed time. 2 days after the warehouse sale closed, one of his remaining drivers applied for a role with us. Then another, and another. Some of them didn't even realize the company was folding. They just sensed it. Late checks, route cuts, equipment being quietly pulled from the yard. When I asked one applicant what made him leave, he said, "No one's at the helm anymore. It's like the lights are still on, but everyone's pretending they don't see the smoke." I onboarded the top 3 and assigned them to expansion routes in the southern corridor. Meanwhile, our new logistics platform went live in 3 states. First quietly, then publicly. We rolled out a targeted outreach campaign to Ron's mid-tier clients, offering seamless transition terms. I didn't reference him, didn't mention the acquisition. I just offered something better, faster, more reliable, and built by people who actually understood the routes. By the end of the year, we'd absorbed 7 of his former contracts. 3 were direct re-signs. 4 came through third-party referrals. Every one of them cited lack of confidence in leadership as the reason for switching. I didn't correct them. I didn't celebrate either. I just kept building. The logistics lead I'd hired took me aside one afternoon and asked what my long-term plan was for the new warehouse. I told her I hadn't decided yet. She said we should rebrand it, take down the old Langston signage, and install our own. I said we'd wait. Let the dust settle first. She nodded. Then she smiled. First time I'd seen her do that since joining us. You're doing it right, she said. Clean, quiet, smart. I didn't answer. Just kept reviewing the route data on my screen. Because that was the whole point. No theatrics. No headlines. Just steady hands on the wheel. While Ron scrambled to plug holes, I was laying track. While Alex tried to calm vendors, I was opening new lanes. While they focused on what was slipping through their fingers, I built something they never saw coming. And I wasn't finished yet. The final papers were ready by the first week of January. My legal team handled the last of the filings, quiet, efficient, with no delays. Structurally, it was straightforward. The majority debt position gave us control. The lease expiration left no operational fallback. We had every document we needed. There were no more negotiations, no more unknowns. Still, I scheduled the meeting. Not because I needed to, but because it felt necessary to close it the way it started. Face to face, in the office where I'd spent years being dismissed. I didn't bring anyone with me. No counsel, no assistant. Just a folder with final acquisition documents, 2 sets of keys, and a list of transitional options we'd prepared in case he wanted to negotiate a soft landing. Ron didn't stand when I entered. He didn't look surprised either, more like he was still hoping I'd blink. He glanced at the folder as I set it on the table. You can't do this, he said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a protest. Just disbelief. I didn't respond. Because he still didn't get it. This wasn't a stunt. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was business. And everything he'd taught me, intentionally or not, had brought me to that moment. He opened the folder, flipped through the first few pages, then stopped. He didn't ask questions. He didn't yell. He just sat there. I could see the wheels turning, slow and reluctant. Realizing what the numbers meant. Realizing how far he'd fallen. Realizing who was sitting across from him now. I made mistakes, he said. I nodded. Then he asked the only question that seemed to matter to him. Are you keeping the name? No, I said. We're rebranding. He closed the folder. That was the end of it. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain myself. There was nothing left to say. He hadn't just lost his company, he'd lost the narrative, the version of himself he'd spent decades protecting. And that was always the thing he valued most. As I stood to leave, he looked up. Not angry anymore, just tired. You're really going through with this, he said. I already have. I left the keys on the table and walked out. The building was quieter than I remembered. Fewer people, fewer calls. Most of the desks had been cleared. I passed Alex in the hallway. He looked up from his phone, startled to see me there. We need to talk, he said. I nodded toward a nearby conference room. We sat down, no small talk. I heard about the offer, he said. I had extended a position to him, junior strategic analyst, limited authority, mentorship included, if he wanted it. It wasn't an insult. It was a path. A way to stay in the business, rebuild the skill set, learn the part he'd skipped over when Ron pushed him to the front. He slid the offer back across the table. I can't take that, he said. I didn't push. It's not about the title, he added. It's just, I don't want to work for you. I nodded. Maybe he thought that would hurt. Maybe it was supposed to be defiant. But I didn't take it personally. I stood, thanked him for his time, and told him the door would stay open 6 months, no promises after that. He didn't answer, just looked at the floor as I walked out. Outside, the sun was sharp, low on the horizon. The parking lot was mostly empty. My car was parked in the same row I used to walk past every morning when Ron would arrive late and still take the credit for early meetings. It looked smaller now. All of it. We took down the Langston sign the following Monday, quietly, before business hours. No photos, no ceremony, just a crew, a truck, and a name that no longer held weight. In its place, we installed the new brand. Steady, modern, without legacy baggage. It wasn't mine, not just mine. It belonged to the people who helped build it. The ones who saw what was coming and chose to stay anyway. Over the next few weeks, we finished the handover. Clients transitioned cleanly. Internal systems aligned. The ops lead Ron had ignored for years found her rhythm with my team almost immediately. We gave her budget authority within the first quarter. She never missed a target. I kept thinking I'd hear from Ron again. Some last attempt. Some final message, but nothing came. No calls, no emails, just silence. I took that as an answer. Sometimes people don't want a second chance. They just want the past to mean something. And when it doesn't, they disappear. I saw Alex once more, months later, at a logistics conference in Chicago. He was standing near a booth for a new routing software company. I nodded. He nodded back, that was it. I don't know what he's doing now. Maybe he'll land on his feet. Maybe he won't. But I meant what I said. The door was open. What Ron never understood was that power isn't taken, it's transferred, quietly, slowly, one choice at a time. And by the time someone notices, it's already gone. We didn't talk about him much after that. There wasn't a reason to. The team moved forward. The business stabilized. And I kept going, not with fanfare, just momentum. Because there was still more to build. It's been just over a year now. The new logo on the Richmond warehouse is understated. Slate gray against the brick facade, clean lines, no legacy lettering. But underneath it, on a smaller plaque by the main entrance, there's a name. Langford Distribution. My father's. Not the old company name, not mine, just his. He walks the floor every Sunday morning. Same route every time. Starts in receiving, loops through the cold storage, finishes at the dispatch board where the week's runs are posted. He doesn't need to check anything. We have a full team now, trained, competent, tight on metrics. But he still likes to see it. The movement, the system. The outcome of all the long, unpaid hours he used to spend at our old shared desk with a phone in one hand and a billing spreadsheet in the other. He doesn't say much when he walks. Sometimes he'll stop to talk to a dispatcher or flag a line in the route summary. Other times he just gives a short nod. That's how I know he approves. The rest of the week, I'm in the main office or on the road. We've expanded to 2 new markets since the acquisition. Picked up 4 of Ron's former clients. 3 came to us voluntarily. 1 we had to win back. They didn't need much convincing. Our delivery reliability sits at 97.4%. Our reroute time is down 42% since last quarter. The people who left Langston Freight didn't leave the industry. They left chaos. When they saw we were offering stability, not just logistics, but structure, clarity, accountability, they returned without needing a pitch. We don't talk about Ron much anymore. He's not in the news, not on the forums, not showing up at regional conferences. I assume he's retired, maybe quietly, maybe with some version of a story he tells to close friends. That's his choice. I don't track it. Alex didn't take the job. I haven't heard from him since that day in the hallway. One of my staff mentioned he's working for a private equity firm now. Advisory role. Mostly client relations. It fits. That world rewards confidence more than results. He'll be fine. But sometimes I wonder if he ever looked back and understood what actually happened. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about legacy. It wasn't even about being right. It was about showing up every day and doing the work. That's the part people forget. They see the final moves, the acquisition, the rebrand, the clean signage. They don't see the hours, the spreadsheets, the carrier calls at 2 a.m., the margins that don't make sense until you shave off another 0.5% through route consolidation. I didn't win because I had more capital. I won because I knew where the weak spots were, because I'd spent years holding up systems that were never mine to begin with. That's the irony in all of it. Ron used to say, I was too young to understand business. He said it more than once, always with a smirk, always in front of someone else, like he was protecting me from my own ambition. But I understood enough to know that ego doesn't stabilize a balance sheet. That bravado doesn't reroute freight when a snowstorm closes I-95. That clients don't care how many awards you've won, they care if the delivery shows up on time, undamaged, and with the right invoice code. I understood that, even when he didn't. And that was the beginning of the end. Not for me, but for him. Because once someone starts believing their version of the story is the only one that matters, they stop listening. They stop adapting. They stop seeing the quiet ones in the room, the ones holding it all together. People ask me sometimes if I miss the old days, the partnership, the history, the simplicity. I don't. What I miss is believing that people like Ron were untouchable. That kind of belief is comforting when you're on the bottom. When you still think success is about pedigree and connections and the right handshake at the right lunch table. But now I know better. Even giants fall, especially when they stop checking the foundation. Especially when they underestimate the ones still sweeping the floors, running the reports, calling the vendors, signing the back of the checks while someone else signs the front. I don't need to tell that story out loud. The numbers do it for me. Last quarter, our operating margin beat forecast by 11%. Our customer retention hit 99%. And we're expanding into long-haul freight next fiscal year, with 2 new carrier partnerships already signed. My name isn't on the building, but it's in every document, every plan, every route optimization tool we've built from the ground up. And the people who run it, the people who used to be passed over, overlooked, sidelined, they're the ones making the decisions now, not because I gave them a chance, but because they earned it. Like I did. That's the part Ron never understood. You can't control loyalty. You have to deserve it. The best part? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't post a takedown thread. I didn't ask anyone to pick sides. I just kept going. And when the time came to make my move, I didn't have to push. I just signed the papers. And watched the empire he'd built, the one he thought no one could touch, change hands in silence. That's the thing about being too young to understand business. Sometimes the youngest ones are the only ones still paying attention. Thanks for sticking with me through this story. Have you ever been underestimated at work, or had someone take credit for something you built? What did you do about it? Let me know in the comments. I read every one. And if this story hit close to home, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder. Staying quiet doesn't mean staying small. Sometimes it's just strategy.